My professor said I wasn't cut out for this field. My field has heard of me now. The room was quieter than I expected. I'd imagined this moment 100 times, walking into that conference hall, name badge around my neck, the kind of badge that gets you into the green room. I'd imagined how I would feel. Nervous, maybe. Vindicated, absolutely. I'd pictured myself scanning the room for familiar faces, heart pounding, hands slightly trembling. But standing there, in a room of 400 of the most respected people in my field, people who had cited my work, who had emailed me asking questions I couldn't have answered 5 years ago, I felt something I didn't expect. I felt completely, utterly calm. And then I saw him. He was standing near the coffee station, older now, a little grayer, holding a lanyard that gave him general admission, not a speaker badge, not a panelist badge, general admission. And he looked up, the way people do when they sense someone staring, and his eyes found mine across the room. I watched the exact moment he placed me. First confusion, then recognition, then, and this is the part that stayed with me for weeks afterward, something that looked a lot like embarrassment. He raised his hand in a small wave. I smiled. Not a victorious smile, not a cold one, just a smile. The kind you give someone you've genuinely moved on from. And then I turned back to the panelist beside me and kept talking. That was it. That was the whole encounter. No confrontation, no carefully rehearsed speech, no moment where I leaned in close and whispered, "Remember what you said to me?" Because here's the thing I had learned over 5 years of grinding, rebuilding, and becoming someone I actually recognized in the mirror. The moment you've truly won isn't the moment they see you succeeding. It's the moment their opinion genuinely stops mattering. I didn't scream. I didn't fight back. I just became someone they never expected. And this is that story. Hey. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time. Either way, I'm glad you're here. This story isn't about revenge. I want to be clear about that from the start, because what I'm about to tell you could easily be framed that way. A professor dismisses a student goes on to excel, professor eats crow, roll credits. But that's not what happened. Or it is what happened, technically, but it's the smallest, least interesting part of the story. The real story is about what I chose to do with a moment that could have ended me. The real story is about becoming. Because the truth is, the professor, we'll get to him, he was almost incidental. He was the spark, not the fire. The fire was mine. And it took a long time to understand that. If this is the kind of story you needed to hear today, I'd love for you to subscribe. Hit that bell. These stories take a long time to tell well, and I want to make sure they reach the people who need them. All right, let's go back to the beginning. Let me tell you who I was. I was 22 years old, first-generation college student, double majoring in biochemistry and molecular biology at a mid-sized state university that I'd chosen not because it was my dream school had waitlisted me, but because they'd offered me a partial scholarship and I could afford it without drowning my family in debt. I want to sit with that for a second. First generation. That means no one in my immediate family had navigated this system before me. No one could tell me what office hours were actually for, or that your GPA in your first 2 years mattered more than you think, or that professors remember students who engage and forget students who disappear. I was learning the rules of a game while everyone else seemed to have grown up playing it. My high school had been fine. I'd been a good student. Not spectacular, but solid. I loved science the way some people love music, not because someone told me I should, but because it lit something in me that nothing else did. I remember being 14 and reading about how CRISPR worked, this molecular scissors that could rewrite the code of living things, and thinking, that is the most astonishing thing I have ever heard. I wanted to spend my life in that world. So I got to college, And the first semester was hard, the way everything new is hard, but I managed. I got a 3.2 GPA, not perfect, but not terrible, especially given I was working 20 hours a week at the campus library to supplement my scholarship. Second semester was harder. I failed an exam, my first real failure, an organic chemistry midterm. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 45 minutes afterward because I didn't want anyone to see me cry. I scraped a C+ in that class. The shame of it felt enormous. But I kept going. Junior year, I applied to join the research lab of a faculty member I'll call Dr. Harmon. He was well-published, ran a competitive lab, and worked in exactly the area I was most passionate about, gene expression and regulatory mechanisms. Getting into his lab felt like the first real step toward the career I'd been building toward since I was 14. I had good grades at this point, not perfect, but a 3.5 cumulative, strong in the upper division science courses. I'd done a summer internship at a biotech company, unpaid, but I'd negotiated it myself, cold emailing 15 companies and getting one yes. I had a letter of recommendation from that supervisor that said, and I remember this word for word, "One of the most intellectually curious students I've worked with in 15 years." I put together my application to join the lab, rewrote my statement of purpose 4 times, asked my academic advisor to review it, walked into Dr. Harmon's office for what I thought would be a formality, a chance to meet, discuss my interests, maybe hear about current projects. He didn't even look up from his computer when I came in. I sat down across from him. The office smelled of old paper and cold coffee. He had my application printed out in front of him. I could see my own name at the top of the page, and he was scrolling through something on his screen as he spoke. "I've looked at your file," he said, still not looking at me. "Your grades are acceptable. Your internship is fine." Fine. But I have to be honest with you. Now he looked up, and the look wasn't unkind exactly. It was something worse than unkind. It was certain. The look of a man who had already made a decision and was just doing the administrative work of delivering it. I remember the specific sensation in my chest, like something had been pressed very firmly inward. "I'm sorry?" I said. "Research," he said. "The kind of career you're describing, it requires a particular kind of mind, a certain ceiling." He said the word ceiling the way you might say height limit on a roller coaster sign. Factual. Final. "Your scores suggest you've worked very hard to get here. That's admirable. But working hard and having the aptitude for original research, those are different things." He kept talking, something about maybe considering science communication or education, or roles that were adjacent to research without requiring the same level of creative intellectual capacity. I heard the words, but I wasn't processing them. I was just sitting there, in that chair, age 22, in an office that smelled like old paper, being told by someone with decades of letters after his name that the thing I loved was probably not meant for me. I thanked him. I don't know why, probably because I'd been raised to be polite, and politeness is what you reach for when you don't know what else to do. I shook his hand. I walked out. I made it to the stairwell before I sat down on the cold concrete steps and put my head in my hands. Now, I want to tell you what I felt in that stairwell, because I think this is the part of these stories that usually gets skipped. We talk about the humiliation, and then we fast forward to the grit and the comeback. But the actual feeling, the specific texture of that moment, matters. Because if you've ever been in a moment like that, I want you to know that what I felt was not fire. It was not immediate defiant rage. It was not, "I'll show him." What I felt was, what if he's right? That's the most honest thing I can tell you. That voice, that quiet, devastating, utterly reasonable-sounding voice, was the real enemy, not Dr. Harmon, not his certainty or his condescension or his ceiling metaphor. That voice that carried his words with me and unpacked them and arranged them on the shelf of every doubt I'd ever had. What if I'd been fooling myself? What if the 3.5 GPA was the ceiling, not the floor? What if the first-generation experience I'd always framed as an obstacle to overcome was actually a sign that I'd already reached further than I was supposed to? I stopped sleeping well. My grades, which had been improving, plateaued. I went to classes on autopilot. I applied to a different research lab, a less competitive one, and got in, but I half-hearted my way through the first semester there, pipetting and taking notes and going through the motions without the spark that had gotten me interested in science in the first place. I was 22 years old, and I was already grieving a future I hadn't even tried for yet. My roommate at the time, I'll call her Priya, she's one of the sharpest people I've ever known, now a physician doing incredible work in underserved communities. She saw what was happening to me before I could articulate it. One night, maybe 3 months after the meeting with Dr. Harmon, she knocked on my door at 11 p.m., came in, sat on the floor across from my desk and said, "You've been different since that professor meeting. Are you going to let one person decide your entire life?" I told her it wasn't just him. It was what he represented. He knew this field. He'd been in it for 30 years. What if his assessment was simply accurate? She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that I've thought about almost every week since. The most confident people in any field are not always the most accurate ones. They're just the ones who stopped doubting themselves earliest. That doesn't make them right about you. It just makes them comfortable. I didn't have a transformation that night. I want to be real about that. It wasn't a movie moment where one conversation flipped a switch, but something shifted, very slightly, like the first degree of a turn that will eventually bring you around a full 180. A small, quiet, almost reluctant thought. What if I just tried? Actually tried. Not to prove him wrong, just to find out for myself. And that's when everything started to change. The decision didn't come in a flash. It arrived slowly, the way conviction usually does. Not a lightning strike, but a gradual brightening. Here is what the decision actually looked like, practically. It was a Tuesday morning in February. I was sitting at my laptop with my second cup of bad dining hall coffee and a tab open to the PhD program requirements for 3 different universities. I'd opened that tab probably 40 times in the past 6 months and closed it every time without doing anything. That morning, I opened a new document, and I started writing. Not an application, not yet. Just an honest inventory. What did I know? What could I learn? What would I need to become to be the kind of researcher Dr. Harmon thought I wasn't capable of being? I filled 6 pages. It was uncomfortable to read. There were real gaps. My statistics background was weak. I had surface-level familiarity with several techniques I should have known more deeply. I hadn't published anything, even as an undergraduate co-author. My GRE scores were okay, but not competitive for the top programs. I stared at that document for a long time, and then I did something that changed the entire trajectory of what came next. Instead of reading it as evidence that Dr. Harmon was right, I read it as a to-do list. Not these are my limitations, but these are the next 12 months of my life.
I want to talk about what that gap year actually looked like because I think we romanticize transformation. We compress it. We show the before and the after and gesture at the middle like it was just a montage. Upbeat music, calendar pages flipping, person running at dawn. The middle is where the real story lives, and it is not glamorous. So here's what the middle looked like for me. Months 1 through 3. I signed up for a statistics course at the local community college, in person after my regular classes twice a week. I was 22 years old, sitting in a class with people taking it to finish their associate's degrees, and I did not care even slightly because that course gave me a foundation I'd been missing for 2 years. I also, and this feels small, but it wasn't, I emailed the professor of that lab I'd been half-heartedly working in, and I said, essentially, I want to do more. I want to be more useful. What would make me genuinely valuable here? He seemed surprised by the question. He gave me a project, a small one, analyzing some existing datasets, writing up a preliminary literature review, nothing glamorous, but I did it with everything I had. Month 4, I discovered something that sounds obvious but felt revelatory. The researchers I most admired were not superhuman geniuses who'd never struggled. They were people who had written and failed, and revised and failed, and kept refining until something clicked. I found the blog of a scientist I'll call Dr. Chen. She was in her early career, maybe 5 years post-PhD, already doing impressive work, and she wrote honestly about her own academic journey, about the desk rejections, the failed experiments, the advisor who'd been unkind. She wrote, "Every paper that has my name on it contains at least 10 failed versions no one will ever see. That's not a bug in the process. That's the process." I printed that out, taped it above my desk.
Month 5 through 7, I started reading. Not the overview textbooks I'd been assigned, but primary literature, papers, the real stuff. 2 papers a week at first, with a notebook beside me to track every term I didn't understand and then look up. Then 3 papers a week, then 5. I started to see patterns. I started to develop opinions. I started to have thoughts like, this methodology seems weaker than what this other team used, which is such a small thing, but it meant I was engaging with science as a thinking person, rather than a student trying to absorb the correct answer. I also need to talk about what was happening emotionally during this period, because I don't want to make this sound purely logistical. The hurt from that meeting with Dr. Harmon didn't evaporate. It didn't even really diminish at first. It lived in me, showed up uninvited in the middle of otherwise good days. What I learned to do, and this took time, and I'm not sure I could have articulated it as a strategy at the time, was to separate the wound from the work. I let myself feel the hurt. Priya and I talked about it a lot. I wrote about it in a journal I've since kept up for 5 years now, but I refused to let the hurt become the reason I worked, because revenge is a terrible fuel. It burns dirty and it burns fast, and it leaves you empty when you finally get there. I decided, consciously, explicitly, on a night when I wrote it down, that I was doing this for the version of myself who was 14, reading about CRISPR for the first time. Not for Dr. Harmon, not to make him wrong, for her, for the girl who thought this was the most astonishing thing she'd ever heard. Month 8. The professor of the lab I was working in, I'll call him Professor Adeyemi, asked me to present my literature review to the rest of the group. I was terrified. My previous presentations had been workmanlike at best. I spent 2 weeks preparing. I revised the slides 14 times. I practiced out loud in my room with my laptop camera on, watching myself back, which is a uniquely uncomfortable experience that I highly recommend. The presentation went well, better than well. Professor Adeyemi asked me to expand the review into something we might develop further. One of the graduate students in the lab, a third-year PhD student who'd mostly ignored me until this point, pulled me aside afterward and said, "That was genuinely impressive. Where did that come from?"
I didn't say, from rage and a statistics course at a community college and 14 presentation revisions, I just said, thank you. But I felt something settle in me, a kind of quiet, solid confidence that had nothing to do with what anyone else thought and everything to do with what I'd watched myself do. Month 11, I submitted my applications to PhD programs, 7 schools, including 2 that Dr. Harmon would have considered reach schools for someone like me.
The wait was brutal. I applied in December, and PhD programs in the life sciences typically notify in February and March. Those 3 months felt like a full year. I questioned everything constantly. I refreshed email compulsively. I bargained with the universe in ways that embarrass me to remember. In February, the first rejection came, then another. And then, one Thursday evening, around 7 p.m., I opened an email from the graduate admissions office of a program I'd wanted desperately. "We are pleased to offer you admission." I sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then I called Priya. Then I called my mother, who cried on the phone for 10 minutes. Then I went for a run in the February cold because I didn't know what else to do with the feeling in my body. I was accepted to 3 programs in total, including one of the 2 reach schools. That night, I thought about Dr. Harmon's word, ceiling. I thought, I had barely found the floor yet. And that's when everything started to change. PhD programs are humbling. Let me say that plainly, because I don't want the narrative to become, I got in and then everything was smooth and triumphant from there. The first year of a PhD program is designed, somewhat deliberately, to make you feel like the least knowledgeable person in any room. I arrived at my program with 3 other incoming students who'd come from Ivy League institutions, one who'd graduated summa cum laude from a program rated in the top 5 in the country, and one who had already published 2 first author papers as an undergraduate. I had my statistics community college course and my 14-slide presentation. I am not exaggerating when I say that the first week of the program, I went home and sat in my empty apartment and thought, you have made a terrible mistake. But here's what was different now. That voice, the one that had flattened me in Dr. Harmon's stairwell, I recognized it. I knew its rhythms. I knew how it worked. And I had a document on my laptop, updated monthly now, called Evidence. Every small win, every competent thing I'd done, every moment someone had said, impressive, or where did that come from? It was all in there. When the voice showed up, I opened the document. Not as arrogance, not as performance, as data. My PhD advisor was everything Dr. Harmon was not. I'll call her Professor Vasquez. She had a reputation for being demanding, which worried me when I chose the lab. What I learned quickly was that her demands were accompanied by radical belief in her students. She expected a great deal, and she also expected you to succeed. She'd walk into lab meeting, look at a data set that wasn't working, and say, okay, so that hypothesis was wrong. Good, now we know something. What do we do with that? She changed the way I understood failure. I want to walk you through the transformation year by year because it wasn't one dramatic event. It was dozens of tiny inflection points, each one almost invisible. And then one day you look back and you can't quite see the person you were before. Year 1. I took my qualifying exams. Every PhD student in the life sciences takes these, comprehensive exams that are intended to test whether you know enough to conduct original research. The failure rate in my program historically was around 25%. I passed on my first attempt, not with the highest score in my cohort, but I passed, comfortably. And more importantly, I understood what I'd been tested on. The statistics background I'd built, it showed up in 3 of the 5 sections. The literature reading habit, I could cite relevant work that my examiners hadn't even included in their study materials. Professor Vasquez said afterward, "You're stronger than you look on paper. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise."
She had no idea she was the second person to give me a version of that speech, and that the first one had said the exact opposite. Year 2. My first real research project began to yield data. Science is genuinely mostly failure. You design an experiment, it doesn't work, you figure out why, you redesign, you try again. What I discovered about myself in this year was that I had an unusual tolerance for iteration. Where some of my cohort found the repetition demoralizing, I found it almost meditative. Every failed experiment was a narrowing of the possible. I'd read enough literature to understand that the scientists I most admired had, almost universally, spent years in exactly this space. I wrote up my first real conference abstract. It was accepted as a poster presentation at a regional conference, small, not glamorous, but my name in print, my work in the room. I stood beside that poster for 6 hours straight. I talked to anyone who would stop. I answered questions I knew the answers to and said, "That's a great question. I'm still working on that," which is, I have since learned, the correct and honest answer that every good scientist gives.
At the end of the day, a faculty member from another institution, someone whose paper I'd cited in my literature review, someone I recognized from their author photo, stopped, read the poster for a long time, and said, "This is a clever approach. Have you thought about this angle?" And then she handed me her card. I still have that card. Year 2.5, I started writing. Not papers yet, just writing. Blog posts initially for the university's science communication platform. I'd remembered Dr. Harmon's suggestion, dismissive as it had been, that I consider science communication. The irony was that he meant it as a consolation prize, a lesser path. What I found was that communicating science well, clearly, accessibly, accurately, required me to understand my own work at a depth that technical writing alone didn't demand. If you can explain it to someone who doesn't have your background, you understand it. Those blog posts got read, more than I expected. One of them, about the implications of a recent paper in our field, got shared by a researcher with a significant following in the scientific community. My follower count went from 30 to 300 overnight. A small thing, but it opened a door I hadn't known existed. Here's the invisible transformation that was happening alongside all of this, and it's the one I most want you to hear. I was becoming someone who didn't need validation to keep going. That sounds simple. It is not simple. It took approximately 2.5 years of deliberate, sometimes painful work on my own internal wiring. What I mean concretely is this. I had spent so much of my early academic life seeking signals from authority figures, grades, acceptance, praise, approval, and Dr. Harmon's dismissal had paradoxically begun to break that dependency. Because if the authority figures could be that catastrophically wrong, if someone with 30 years of experience could look at me and see a ceiling that didn't exist, then what exactly was I orienting my entire self-worth around? I started doing things because I found them worth doing. I started saying yes to opportunities because they interested me, not because they would look impressive. I started saying no to things that didn't align with what I was genuinely trying to build, even when saying no felt risky. I developed, slowly, a relationship with my own judgment. That is not a small thing. That might be the whole thing. Year 3. My first paper was submitted to a journal. The peer review process in academic science is famously brutal. Your work is read by anonymous experts who can and will point out every weakness, every overclaim, every methodological gap.
My paper came back with what's called major revisions, not rejection, but a substantial list of concerns that needed addressing. I spent 6 weeks on those revisions. I addressed every single point. Some of them required me to run new experiments. Some of them required me to reframe arguments I'd been attached to. One of the reviewers, and I will love this reviewer forever, wrote, "The authors have done something genuinely novel here. The execution needs strengthening, but the core idea is worth pursuing." The paper was accepted 4 months after initial submission. When the acceptance email came, I was in the middle of a completely mundane Tuesday. I was eating a sandwich at my desk. I read the email 3 times. I finished my sandwich. Then I called my mother, who cried again, and I cried this time too. My name, in print, in a peer-reviewed journal, in a field that a man in a coffee-smelling office had told me probably wasn't a good fit for my particular ceiling. Professor Vasquez forwarded me an email that evening from a researcher at another institution who'd seen the paper in early access publication and wanted to discuss potential collaboration. "Your name is starting to travel," she wrote, and that's when everything started to change. Year 4, the external recognition began. The collaboration Professor Vasquez had forwarded led to a co-authored paper, which led to an invitation to present at a national conference, not as a poster, but as a short talk in a symposium session. I prepared for 6 weeks. I gave the talk to my lab 6 times before I gave it to the room of 200 people who'd registered for that session. After the talk, there was a line, a literal, actual line of people waiting to speak with me. I stood there in the conference hall for 90 minutes after my session ended, talking to researchers from institutions I dreamed about as an undergraduate, answering questions about my work, taking cards, giving mine. One conversation was with a program director who asked if I'd ever considered their institution for a postdoctoral fellowship. I had not known at 22 what a postdoctoral fellowship was. I told her I was absolutely interested. Now we're back to the beginning of this story. 5th year of my PhD. The conference, a major annual meeting in my field, the kind with 400 attendees and a waiting list for registration. I was there as an invited speaker in a session on emerging research. My abstract had been selected from open submissions by a program committee. My name was in the conference booklet. My institution and department were listed under my name. The institution? Not the university where Dr. Harmon still taught. The department? The exact field he'd told me I wasn't cut out for. I want to be very honest with you about something. In the weeks leading up to this conference, I had known there was a chance he'd be there. It's a fairly specialized field. People tend to show up at the same conferences. I looked at the registration list. Yes, you can see who's registered, and his name was on it. And I felt almost nothing. Not numbness, not repression, not performance. Genuinely, almost nothing. I was thinking about my talk. I was thinking about the collaborators I wanted to see. I was thinking of a new project that was beginning to take shape, and the methodological questions I wanted to get other people's input on. Dr. Harmon's presence in the building was, in the hierarchy of things I cared about, very low. That itself was the victory, not the encounter, the indifference. But the encounter did happen. Let me tell you how it actually went. I was standing near the registration desk about an hour before my session, talking to a researcher I'd met at the previous year's conference, someone who had read my paper and followed up with questions, and who had become something like a mentor figure in the broader community. We were in the middle of a genuinely fascinating conversation about the limitations of a methodology that had become standard in our field, a conversation I was fully present for, when I felt the particular awareness of being looked at. I've learned over years of conference going that this is a real thing, the sensation of eyes. I glanced up, and there he was. Grayer, a little softer around the edges. Conference lanyard, general admission.
He was standing maybe 20 feet away with a cup of coffee, and he'd clearly just recognized me. I watched his face go through its calculation. I've thought about that calculation since. In those 2 or 3 seconds, I imagine he was running through, is that? Yes, the student, the one and she's here as, oh. He raised his hand, small wave, and I did something I hadn't planned and wouldn't have predicted. I smiled at him, warmly, genuinely, and nodded, and turned back to my conversation. That was it. He did approach me later, during the coffee break following my session, which had gone well. Very well, actually. There had been good questions from the audience, engaged questions, and I'd handled them with the ease of someone who knows their material deeply because they've lived inside it for 5 years. He came over with his coffee cup and said, "I watched your talk. It was very impressive." I want to describe to you what happened inside me in that moment, because it's important. There was a flicker, a small human flicker of the 22-year-old in that stairwell, the one who'd sat on cold concrete with her head in her hands. She was there for about 2 seconds, and then she stepped back, because I realized he was looking for something, absolution, maybe, or reconnection, or the satisfaction of being magnanimous, of being the senior person who had the grace to acknowledge a former student's success. There was a way in which his approval, even now, was still angled towards centering himself. I said, "Thank you. It's been a lot of work. Are you enjoying the conference?" Just that. Normal. Polite. Warm, even. We talked for maybe 5 minutes. He mentioned at one point that he remembered me from his lab selection process years ago. I said, "Yes, I remember." No edge in my voice, just acknowledgement. He said something like, "I think I may have misjudged where you'd land." I could tell he was waiting for me to reassure him, to say, "Oh, it worked out fine," to smooth over the discomfort of the moment and release him from it. I didn't. I said, "It was a difficult conversation, but it pushed me in directions I probably needed." All of which was true, all of which was honest, none of which absolved him of anything, and none of which required me to carry his discomfort for him. Then someone touched my arm, another researcher wanting to pick up our conversation from earlier, and I said, "I have to get back. It was good to see you," and I meant it, the way you mean something that is simply and neutrally true, and I walked away. Pause. That evening, in my hotel room, I sat with what had happened, and I felt, this is the word that keeps coming back, complete. Not because I'd won, not because he'd acknowledged he was wrong, but because I could look at that interaction and see that I had brought my whole, actual self to it, not a performance of graciousness, not a fantasy of confrontation, just me. Someone who'd done hard work, who'd built something real, who'd processed an old wound and let it become scar tissue rather than an open cut. The best revenge isn't making them regret what they said. The best revenge is being so solidly yourself that their opinion becomes genuinely irrelevant. I'd gotten there. I had genuinely gotten there. And here's the piece I want you to really sit with. Dr. Harmon was wrong about me. That is simply factually true. But he wasn't trying to destroy me. He wasn't a villain. He was a tired professor with biases he probably didn't fully recognize, making a quick judgment about a student who didn't fit the profile he was used to seeing succeed. Humans do this. Humans in positions of authority do this constantly, and the damage is real, and it is also not the final word unless you let it be. He was wrong. I went anyway. That's the whole story. Pause. In the years since that conference, and it's been a few now, the work has continued. The second paper led to a third, and the third was published in one of the journals in my field that I had held in something like reverence when I was a junior in college. I completed my PhD. I accepted The postdoctoral fellowship I'd been approached about at that national conference. I've given talks at 7 conferences now, including 2 international ones. Last year, a paper I co-authored was cited in a review article written by a researcher I'd been reading since I was an undergraduate. I read that citation maybe 10 times. My field has heard of me now, not because I was the loudest or the most pedigreed or the most naturally gifted person in any room I occupied, because I kept showing up, because I turned a to-do list into a life's work, because I chose, over and over, to build rather than to burn. There's something I think about often, and I want to share it with you. What if I'd walked out of that stairwell and accepted Dr. Harmon's verdict? What if I'd taken the path he suggested, science communication, education, something adjacent? Would that have been a bad life? No. There are people doing tremendous, meaningful work in those spaces, but it wouldn't have been my life. And the cost of not living your own life, the specific, peculiar, particular life you are actually built for, is enormous in ways that are hard to quantify and impossible to unfeel. What saved me, ultimately, was not anger. It was curiosity. A stubborn, persistent 14-year-old's curiosity about CRISPR and gene expression and the astonishing, improbable fact that living things can be understood and that understanding them might make the world better. That curiosity was mine. No one could give it to me and no one could take it away. Find the thing that's yours. Build from there. The rest is details. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with a few things. Not a listicle, not 10 tips for glowing up, just the distilled truth of what I actually learned. 1. The people who doubt you are not oracles. They are people with their own fears, biases, reference points, and bad days. Their certainty about your ceiling is a reflection of their experience, not your potential. Take their input seriously enough to examine it, no more seriously than that. 2. Transformation takes longer than a montage and shorter than a lifetime. The gap period, the quiet grind, the community college statistics course, the 14 presentation revisions, that is not the waiting room before the real work begins. That is the work. Honor the gap. Live in it, fully. 3. Build a few relationships that are not transactional. Priya, Professor Vasquez, the researchers whose card I still have, these people didn't make me, but they gave me enough safety to try. You cannot do this entirely alone, and you shouldn't have to. 4. Process the wound. Don't skip this. Journaling, talking, therapy if you have access to it, whatever the mechanism, find a way to hold the hurt without letting it drive. Hurt that's buried alive will show up sideways, in self-sabotage, in the need to prove yourself to people who aren't watching, in choices made from fear rather than desire. 5. Reframe the encounter before it happens. If there is someone in your life whose opinion still has more power over you than you'd like, imagine seeing them when you've become who you're becoming. Notice what you want to say. Notice what you want them to feel. And then gently ask yourself, is this still for me or is it for them? The moment your answer is fully and genuinely for me, that's when you know you're free. I want to end with something personal. I still think about that 22-year-old sitting on cold concrete stairs in a parking garage holding a C+ organic chemistry grade and a future she was afraid to claim. I think about her, and I want to tell her, you're going to be fine, better than fine, but not because of anyone's permission, because of yours. That's the permission that matters, the one you give yourself. The best revenge is living well, but only if you're doing it for yourself. only if the life you're living is genuinely yours. The world is not short of critics, doubters, and people who'll hand you their assessment of your ceiling like it's a gift. What's genuinely rare, is someone who takes that assessment, examines it honestly, and then sets it down and climbs anyway. Be that person. You don't need anyone's blessing to begin. Thank you for spending this time with me. These stories are long because transformation is long. It doesn't fit in a short video, and I wanted to honor that. If this reached you today, if any part of this felt like something you needed to hear, I would love to know. What's your glow-up story? What's the moment someone underestimated you that you're still turning into fuel? Tell me in the comments below. I read every one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. More stories like this one are coming. Stories about becoming, about the quiet, unannounced, utterly private revolution of deciding you are more than what someone else decided you were. I'll see you in the next one.